So me, I spent now, I'm 38, so I've spent at least 28 years, I would say, maybe give myself the grace of having 10 years, probably more, 30 years at least of studying spirituality on different levels. I started off when I was young. It was not something that I just was doing naturally. It was something that I was more or less forced to do, and actually didn't even know there was an alternative. So I guess you can't even say it was forced. I was raised around spiritual books. That was our TV. And we were encouraged and to not basically watch TV. We were homeschooled. And my mom was very strict about that. She had a very strong awareness about overall what the school curriculum was attempting to do and what society was attempting to do inside of the families and breaking up households and introducing kids to things that they're nowhere near prepared for mentally, spiritually, physically. And so she kept us shielded in many ways from that world. And in exchange, she gave us this spiritual world that she was embarking on and that she was studying. And her thing is that she just never became limited to any tradition. So she went through the Christianity, through the Islam, through the Gnosticism, and through many other traditions. And I kind of caught somehow, I guess, through resonance, what she was ultimately looking for, which was a relationship with what we would say is God, and how to obtain one of these very elusive relationships, especially if it's supposed to be something direct and something vivid. So I desired that, especially when I got into my 20s, to have a vivid connection with this being known as God. And that was what my 20s and towards my later years in my later 20s pretty much consist of, is me going through this, what I call occultation, which is more or less like an invisible initiation that's happening through synchronicity and happening through different circumstances that you didn't really plan, that gives you a broader awareness and starts connecting all of the dots. So that's what I went through. And now for the past 10 years, I've been demystifying a lot of things for people with the plethora of information that's been made available in the spiritual field. And I've also grounded a lot of my message and a lot of the aspects of how we look at spirituality into common things. So that way we can start the expansion, not just by thinking of ourselves as high or greater or holy or powerful or any of that, but more so the actions that we're engaging in that equal real vivid results in our spiritual growth. So that's, if I could nutshell it, that's what would be, who I am and where I'm coming from. And my authority is only within the accolades that I've achieved from the actual accomplishments of what I've done. And that's kind of like how I like it to stand. I like to actually, if I say, hey, this is what we need in the community, instead of getting on every single day and doing that, what I'll generally do is the moment that I mention that, I'll get off and I'll start working on the process of how to get something like that developed, which generally creates having some kind of at least technological know-how, since we're living in this world with all these computers and all this kind of stuff, and ability to be able to network and connect. And then most importantly, just empathy and ability to tap into the resonance field. So that way you kind of know where people are. So that way it doesn't seem like I just try to meet people where they are. I can be anywhere I want to be. I can be on the heights. I can be in the low. You can find me in the hood. You can find me in mansions. So because of that, it's really more important for me to just be where everybody is and see if I can serve up something that makes sense to them to get them to the next level. So that's kind of like what I've deemed as my reason of being here on the planet, or one of the reasons, and that's what I'm doing.
Wow, that's cool, man. I'd love to hear more about. So it sounds like the conditions within which you grew up were ripe for you being interested in what you've now created and are pursuing. Do you remember perhaps a moment or a time period where you started to really catch on to what it sounds like your mom was really trying to assist you in discovering? Was there a book or was there a moment where you're like, oh, wait a second, I get this now. I'm here to assist a transformation, a collective, expansion. Was there any sort of moment or time frame like that you can recall?
For sure. And I would definitely say, just to everyone listening that, when you're going through a process, it becomes totally different than when you're reviewing that process later on. And I think that we can all say that in one way or another, that we go through something and And then we learn about what that something is later on. So life is strange like that. We live it forward, but we understand it backwards. So because of that, I can only like rephrase or paraphrase my previous life as a child of how I started embarking on this spiritual quest. And it actually came in the most simple, silliest ways, because children generally take things literally. So when I was told that you can ask God for whatever you want, well, actually, it started in this sequence where this took a few months or it went over a few days. I'm not sure. But it started with the process of me first seeing something die. And I think that was like a family pet or something like that. He just, killed out. And I was like, okay, so what just happened? And my mom was like, he's dead. And then I was like, okay, so what happens after that? And then she was, in a nutshell, when you're getting these questions from kids, it's like, why? And she was like, well, only God knows, right? So she shifted it off to God, which is always a great technique for parents. And so then I was like, okay, well, we need to talk to this God thing then. How do we do that? And then she was like, oh, you just pray. And anything that you ask God for in prayer, then he'll give it to you. So I think I was about 6 or 7 then, but I must have went in there and just really, really broke down heaven, because the intention that a child does those kind of things with when they have this high level of faith and just zero disbelief is like what we're learning now in The Secret and the power of intention and all this stuff now. But, when you're learning something based on instructions versus you're doing it naturally, there's just a totally different force available to you there. So that's the beginning of my spiritual connection, as I seem to come back, if you may, with a question that was going to be the riddle of my life that design how my life would go from there. And that was what happens when you die. And I felt like that every single venture that people embarked on and things that they felt great about and happy about were just totally frivolous, because if we died and nobody knew what happened then it potentially could make all of our previous experience void and null. So that's how I got very deep into studying these spiritual works. And I think it could have had to do with a little bit of curiosity, because I always liked the whole idea of prophets and the power that they had. And I think that was like my X-Men. But also there was a lot of fear, because I was genuinely afraid, especially through many of these dogmatic traditions, of what their answer was to the outcome of what befell us when we did leave here, especially if we didn't do the right thing.
Right.
And then trying to figure out what the right thing was amidst this sea of spiritual documentation. So I had access to the Cityopigrapha, the Apocryphas, the Qurans, the Bibles, you name it. I had a lot of the dictionaries, the dictionaries of the Bible. So all of these were the books that I was reading as a kid. So imagine when I'm taking all this in, though, because I was actually still a child prodigy. I was double promoted in elementary school. So I had a very high aptitude for comprehension, even though I just had a little bit of issue with my conduct, which you'll discover within intelligent people. But what happened is that through that process, I was just creating what I would say is a point cloud of what the spiritual world consists of. And if you could imagine, if you're taking dogmatic traditions literal, it could get pretty crazy in there. So I rapidly became, especially in my teens, the go-to person for groups that I was around, people in my own peer group, people a little bit older than me. I was always around people older than me, but I became like the go-to person in relation to spirituality, because I always could I could continue stories. And for a while, I didn't even know where I would get the rest of the story from. And then I would realize, I must have read it in another one of those spiritual books. So I would be able to continue what happened after Genesis. I would be able to continue what went on with the giants. I would be able to continue after Revelations, because there's books in the Apocrypha that are written after the Revelation. So I'd have these extra stories, and people would be like, where did you find that out? And I'd be like, it's in the Bible. And they'd be like, no, it's not. And then I'd go through the Bible and I'd try to find it. And I'm like, oh, okay, it's not. It kind of stops right here. But I'm telling you, there's another book that it actually continues. And now, of course, I know all those books and how I'd gotten that information. But that's what happened, is that because I had totally immersed myself into that or been immersed in it, a seed was planted. And that's even what they say in the church. And we're planting a seed in them. So once that seed was planted, it really started taking root, especially like in my later teens, early 20s. And it just became where I had a separate set of guidance almost like, you know, how sometimes if you're playing a game or you're going on a website, they have these little help tickers that pop up, like, go here, do this. And in my life, that's kind of what I had, is I had this voice running that would be like the old wise sage, just regurgitating stuff that I had read, you know, when I was 5, 6, you know, 10 or whatever, in relation to the situation I was experiencing. And then I had this high inclination again to crack through these mysteries. And it wasn't long until I had enough supporting experience, not just evidence, but enough experience to know that not only is something going on, and not only is this something not being truly documented, but the sheer ramifications of what I discovered hinted on a massive conspiracy. And meaning that in one instance where I actually saw an apparition, I actually saw an entity, and I wasn't high, nothing was going on. I was just reading a spiritual book, and then all of a sudden something came through the room and then went out the other side underneath the door. And when I went through that experience, it was, instead of like a fear, it was more like a eureka, that at this point, now I have proof that something else exists. But my biggest concern is, why isn't this like the first period in high school, like first period in spirituality? You know, you figure out some of those things that walk around that normally people can't see. So, you know, it's like I felt like that this world was going to offer more potential for us to answer this question that I felt like we all needed to know the answer to: what happens when you die. And that maybe we were going in the wrong direction if we were spending billions of dollars on stealth bombers and those kind of things. And if we took that money, and that's how my mindset was, if we took that money and we embarked on this field of trying to discover what this stuff really was that I was seeing, that we would probably get closer to the answer. And that was like my logical troubleshooting of how we can find out the answer to what happens when we die. And unfortunately, I saw that overall the society, the populace, et cetera, wasn't really concerned with pioneering any more groundwork in the spirituality. Like, there was more work done on cars and computers than there were on our whole spiritual stance. So I guess somehow in my 30s, I decided that that was my real calling, that my calling was to develop and to design and to pioneer every aspect of spirituality, whether it comes from creating things that assist people to be able to boost the energy in their resonance further, to the exploration and the research on certain substances and how they work with allowing us to be able to see and perceive and even tap into other things. So I went at it like a DARPA or a Skunkworks would, but just with the topic of spirituality. And I also had the resources to do that, because the other thing was, since I was still smart, I got into computers very early and I started building clones. And pretty soon I had a decent amount of income and I started getting into the entrepreneurship. And so what happened was, when I got to a certain point in life where I didn't really need to go to work anymore, which happened in my mid-20s, I had the resources that were necessary to start to, you know, just dig into the metaphysical world and see what I could find that I could connect with something. So, yeah, so you see, like, and I guess that's the most important thing to explain to everybody. It definitely wasn't like an overnight thing. It was really a continuous compilation that started to form a very vivid picture of what I was dealing with. And I would need to take things that I experienced or learned from the first time I got here, the first time I can remember, and then connect them with books that I would read years later that, you know, I just happened to find on archive.org in order to connect the dots for me, so that I could really realize what was going on.